On the morning of April 9th in 1945, 80 years ago, a 39-year-old German pastor, preacher, theologian, and teacher named Dietrich knelt to pray. In the previous days, he had pastored to fellow prisoners and jailers alike from his cell in the Flossenbürg concentration camp in Bavaria in Germany. On this day, he spoke to a fellow prisoner of his own fate, telling him, "This is the end, but for me, the beginning." He was then marched outside to the gallows, stripped naked, and hung. After years as a double agent working for the German resistance, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's costly discipleship caught up to him. He was court-martialed by the Reich, found guilty of treason for his involvement in the anti-fascist resistance movement, and executed just 2 weeks before Flossenbürg was liberated by the US Army, and 3 weeks before Hitler committed suicide and Germany surrendered. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was absolutely guilty of treason against the Nazi state. He was absolutely faithful to his God. There must be religious witness. Bonhoeffer grew up in an academic but non-religious family and was obsessed from a young age with eternal questions. As a teenager, he began signing his papers, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, theologian. Uninspired by what he saw as the rote practices of the German church in his era, especially regarding the suffering around him, Bonhoeffer developed a theology alive with love of neighbor, calling Christians to rigorous and sacrificial love in the model of Christ. Believing that the church had fallen into preaching a cheap and individual grace that let people off the hook for their responsibility to one another, he preached what he called costly discipleship to Christ. His was an other-focused theology, calling each Christian away from selfish concerns into the pursuit of an ethical and collective life in the service of God. Bonhoeffer's theology of costly discipleship was soon put to the test. As the Nazi Party rose to power in Germany, the German church that Bonhoeffer had long critiqued acquiesced quickly to the demands of the rising fascist power and aligned itself with the authoritarian state. German Christians created a Reich Church and installed its sympathizers as bishops, banned all members of Jewish descent, put Mein Kampf on church chancels and swastikas on their steeples, and required loyalty oaths of the clergy. Bonhoeffer would sign no such oath. In their preaching and writing and in their training of other clergy at an underground seminary, Bonhoeffer and other dissenting church leaders stringently resisted the alignment of the church and the Nazi state. In 1934, they issued a declaration distancing themselves from the Reich Church and established what they called the Confessing Church, confessing their obedience to the gospel over the state. The Confessing Church became a network of dissenting congregations and clergy, preaching a theology of obedience to God that demanded disobedience to the Nazis. In a 1933 essay, Bonhoeffer declared that there are 3 ways for the church to relate to the state. First, by questioning the legitimacy of state action and holding the state accountable. Second, by helping those who are harmed by the state. And third, by sticking a spoke in the wheel and putting an end to injustice through active and embodied resistance to the actions of the state. In the years of the Third Reich, alongside fellow religious dissenters and resistors, Bonhoeffer did all 3. Preaching in question of the state's actions, helping move Jews out of Nazi Germany through a network of resistors, and in the end, joining a more militant resistance. Throughout his ministry, Bonhoeffer preached costly discipleship in resistance to cheap grace. Throughout the time of the Nazi regime, Bonhoeffer lived that costly discipleship in the resistance movement and with the confessing church. The cost was, indeed, his life. But it was a cost he paid willingly for the sake of his soul. There must be religious witness. Decades later, in 1980, the leftist journalist and Presbyterian pastor Chris Hedges studied at Harvard Divinity School with a contemporary of Bonhoeffer's, ethicist, theologian, and UU luminary, Dr. James Luther Adams. Hedges tells the story of sitting in a classroom with Adams and receiving a warning that at the time sounded slightly hysterical. Adams, then close to 80 years old, told the class that in the next 50 years, his students should all expect to be fighting the Christian fascists. Speaking of the rising Christian right and its rise to political power in America, he told his students in that classroom in 1980, the Nazis would not return with swastikas and brown shirts. Their ideological inheritors had found a mask for fascism in the pages of the Bible. Hedges writes, Adams was not a man to use the word fascist lightly. He was in Germany in 1935 and 1936, worked with the underground anti-Nazi church known as the Confessing Church, led by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Adams was eventually detained and interrogated by the Gestapo, who suggested he might want to consider returning to the United States. Adams left on a night train with framed portraits of Adolf Hitler placed over the contents inside his suitcase to hide the rolls of home movie film that he'd taken of the so-called German Christian church, which was pro-Nazi, and the few individuals who defied them, including the theologians Karl Barth and Albert Schweitzer, and of course Bonhoeffer. The ruse worked when the border police lifted the tops of the suitcases, saw the portraits of the Fuhrer, and closed them up again. Adams carried the film back to the States and began showing them to his students and colleagues, an alert to what was happening abroad, and a warning of what could happen anywhere when the church aligns itself with the fascist state. There must be religious witness. James Luther Adams returned to teach theology and ethics in the United States at Harvard and then at the University of Chicago. He was also, for his entire life, deeply engaged in Unitarian Universalist congregations and founded several UU study groups, one of which, the Prairie Group, I attend each year. For the rest of his long life, he remained a committed participant in and keen observer of religion with a well-informed critique of its shadow side. Hedges wrote that Adams saw in the Christian right long before we did disturbing similarities with the German Christian church and the Nazi Party. Similarities that back in 1980 he said would, quote, in the event of prolonged social instability, see American fascists under the guise of religion rise to dismantle the open society. And here we are, 45, not 50 years later, right on schedule. Deep in climate crisis and its attendant and ongoing instability, watching American fascists under the guise of an openly Christian nationalist religion dismantling the open society. Adams was not hysterical. He was not wrong. He was deeply rooted in a clear-eyed understanding of both history and human nature. For 50 years after his return from Germany, James Luther Adams wrote and preached a theology and social ethics deeply informed by what he had witnessed in the German churches as the Nazis rose. He shared an understanding of the tragic in human nature, how we fail ourselves and are so easily seduced to power over mutuality. He delivered a call for the church toward deep and collective prophetic engagement with the times in clear-eyed resistance to all state oppression. And he taught and advocated for a rigorous social ethic that was both personal and institutional, seeing how a focus on only one or the other hamstrings a robust civil society. Adams had seen in Germany how a theology based solely in personal piety or personal reason could curve a people inward and cut them off from their connections and commitments to one another. The whole world had then seen what authoritarians can do when people are cut off from one another. We can see what authoritarians can do when people are curved inward and cut off from one another. Adams had also seen the cost of what Bonhoeffer called cheap grace, in the atrophy of moral conscience and in the abandonment of community. And over his long career, Adams identified American liberals' own version of cheap grace. He did not let us off the hook. He identified American liberals' own version of cheap grace as an attitude of rational distance from suffering, a flabby commitment to the collective and our covenants with one another, and a confusion of personal conscience for social ethics, that inward curve that fascists love to use to isolate and separate us each from each. In his work, Adams called Unitarian Universalists, religious liberals, and liberals in general toward a deeper commitment to one another, to a social ethic that was shared, to a larger collective and its shared thriving, and to the source of life that asks us to keep faith with it. Adams believed that religious liberals need a conversion experience. Away from comfortable distance and toward a costly commitment to the love that will not let us go. In a 1986 speech at a theological conference, Adams reflected, "In Nazi Germany, I soon came to the question, what is it in my preaching and my political action that would stop this?" He continued, "It is a liberal attitude to say that we keep ourselves informed and read the best papers on the matter, perhaps join a voluntary association now and then. But to be involved with other people so that it costs, and so that one exposes the evil of society requires something like conversion, something more than an attitude. It requires a sense that there's something wrong, and I must be different from the way I have been. There must be religious witness." What is it in our preaching and our political action that would stop all of this? How, in this moment, must we be different from the ways we have been? What does it look like not to sit enraged in front of MSNBC, but to draw closer to one another and all our suffering? To be involved with other people so that it costs something? How might we release the cheap grace of our outrage and deepen into the costly ache of our grief and the trembling truth of our entanglement and the rigorous commitment to show up differently every day from the ways of being that got us all here together? To show up with more presence and clarity, to show up with more curiosity, to show up with more mutual aid and material dedication to communal thriving, to show up needing each other, to show up in deeper solidarity, every day deeper. What would it mean to sense that there is something wrong, not just in the Christian right, but in the broader culture we all share? To recognize that we too must be different from the ways we have been, must devote ourselves to covenant and community and the greater collective more rigorously than we have ever done before, must find ourselves in the grip of love more steadfastly than we have ever been. Must refuse again and again the constant and crushing invitations to dehumanization, never giving up on the worth and dignity of each and all. What would it look like today to love in a way that devastatingly disrupts state violence? And what will it cost? And what would we give for the wholeness of our souls, for the healing of our hearts, for the thriving of us all? We must be religious witness. Let us make it so together.